This is Motivation. I'm Lori Joy Kingwell.
And I'm Chrissy Van. We're two dreamers on two wheels inspired by our community.
And celebrating the voices we're just lucky enough to discover along the ride. So if not already, like, subscribe, follow along, do what you gotta do to not miss an episode.
It's just like a motorcycle. Our ego can be both a powerful tool, but it can also be a tricky beast to handle. It can move us forward with confidence, or it can spin us out of control if we don't keep it in check. I think it's called the wobblies or something like that, which I'm sure we've all felt in life. The ego is essentially a false sense of self created by the mind, and it's responsible for much of our unhappiness and suffering in this world. It is the voice in our head that constantly narrates our life, and it creates stories of separation, fear, and inadequacy. It thrives on identifying with thoughts and external circumstances, and it leads us away from our true essence and into a cycle of discontent. So in this episode, we're diving deep into the role the ego plays in our lives, how it influences our decisions, and what we can do to better master it rather than be mastered by it. By observing our ego, recognizing its influence, and finding balance between self-assurance and humility, we can navigate life's journey with a greater awareness and just peace of mind. This is your motivation.
So this entire episode idea actually came because I was staying in Lori's fabulous Zen den, we'll call it.
Zen den.
It is a Zen den. It's just one of the most soul-fueling little spaces. I love my nightclub, but I was obviously in a space in my life and still am where I'm doing a lot of recalibration and dismantling things and rebuilding things and evaluating things in a very big way. As you've listened to the podcast, you have heard the story of the good old blindside that took place in March, where my husband and I of 20 years have separated. And we're very much still in that, about 3 months and change in. And it was funny because I had gone to a therapy session and I said to Lori after, I don't think I've actually ever done therapy before because it was so intense. And the intensity actually didn't come from my current circumstances. It came from a life of very blocked memories. And we went down this little rabbit hole. And there was a lot of deep-seated emotion within that rabbit hole. And then you start to think of how you're operating in adult life and what you identify with and what you react to. And then you start to get really curious about the why behind that. And so I've really been in this state of my life of getting ultra curious about how I show up, but also how I'm connected to other people. And so when we talk about ego, you can't talk about ego without talking about connectedness, because truthfully, the disillusion of the ego is really where we are able to truly connect to others. And I know it sounds cliche, but the greater good, or this sense of consciousness, this sense of aliveness, this sense of inner essence, whether you call it soul. And we are living in a society where we're very muted from our connection to that. We're operating in autopilot or these loops that we've created. And the thing about an ego is it loves to be fed. It is insatiable. It is hungry, and it is hungry every day. And it is going to do everything that it possibly can in life to ensure that this false sense of self is what you're projecting to the world. It's very much the external world, how we present, how we react to our thoughts, and ultimately communicate that to others. And without creating space to actually recognize that within ourselves, generally, it's going to lead to suffering. And so I actually was reading when I was at Lori's, to circle back of why I started the story there. And you can correct me on the name, Eckhart Tolle or Eckhart Tolle? You know,
I think it's Toll, but like, it gets.
We can
everyone
be
says everything.
Eckhart Tolle. Like,
Eckhart Tolle. Well, most people
whatever it
actually say that because I think it's got the E on the end, but it's Eckhart Tolle. I think from
and
him.
And obviously accomplished, published author. And many books, but it was A New Earth that I grabbed off the shelf. And the thing that I thought was cool is as I went, I loved when other people had books. Lori and I are both big library fans as well. And there were so many different sections highlighted, but A New Earth really focused on relationships. And it was just such an interesting timing read for where I'm currently at in my romantic relationship, but also different relationships I have had or identified for myself in different environments in my life and how much the ego had ruled. Because especially coming from the television industry, Lori, I feel like for so long, I only thought of ego as that person's ego's so big, their head won't fit through the door. And really, I only tied it to a sense of arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, ego can be superiority. A lot of it is trying to feel superior to others. But that was kind of the only element or dot that I would really associate the word with. So I think today is going to be really great. And I also appreciate so much with your counseling background that you're now embarking on, where we can actually dive into what it is and the role that it plays. I'm going to pause as well because I see that you perhaps are frozen because your eyes have been closed for like 3 minutes.
Does it look like I'm meditating?
It really does. Like
I'm seeing it now. I was looking at
peaceful.
you. I was looking at you, so I didn't see it. And then you said it and I look over and I'm like,
it looks like you are the most enlightened you've ever been.
How do we hop back into that? It's the same for me. For so much of my life, I understood ego to be this thing about arrogance, overconfident, inflated ego, all the things. And there's almost that offense that initially gets taken when you realize that you're like, oh, I have an ego and we all have egos. And in small micro ways, I constantly am in an ego state. And it gets me in trouble. And it's not that actual person on the other side that said the thing. It's the part of my ego that's been touched on that. When I say that, it's like what we identify as. Because yeah, we are each individualized people, but as you said, what they talk about is that connection is we are also interconnected. And we're so many things and we're none of those things. You know, you think of the things that you identified at in high school. Do you still identify as those things? There's so many things that we have in our heads that we are. And it affects so much of our life, whether or not life or other people match up with that thing or validate that we're those things, or they threaten whether we're those things or those, labels or skills or whatever it is. We are all walking around with an ego. It's our human condition. Like you say, that part of like our mind that creates. And it's one of those aspects where it's like, there's a lot of great things about it, right? Like it propels us in many ways to do a lot of cool things, or a story that tells us something that creates a whole world, let's say out of your professional life or your home life or hobbies, those kind of things. Like a part of the ego is the fact that we're motorcyclists, like the idea that we identify as motorcyclists, right? Versus people that ride a motorcycle. But we identify as motorcyclists, but we're actually just people that ride motorcycles. Do you know what I mean? Like, but there's an aura that comes along with it, and people start to dress a certain way, and people start to like see themselves as a certain light, and all those different things that just comes with it. But like you said, where it gets in the weeds and where we create a lot of suffering is that when things don't line up towards that, or anything comes in and threatens that identity and that ego, we a lot of times lash out, or we a lot of times feel the discomfort that we need to prove that this is as real as we feel it is, versus recognizing and having a little bit of a space between being like, I'm really none of those things. Like, and that's okay if they don't see it or validate it or give, as long as there's not harm being done to it. But that's very, very, very rarely what takes place. And so usually we say something, or we defend it in a way, and then now there's discourse or conflict, or we take those feelings home and now that person's an asshole and we're going to ruminate on how dare they, and we're going to create this story that dismantles who they are so that their credibility diminishes, so that we don't have to feel the thing about the thing that they said. And we have all these loops that we go in and out of throughout the day. Even just like the inadequacy. I couldn't possibly be that thing. Not from a place of like, I'm not that thing. I am just a, soul having this human experience. But we go down that thing. I can't possibly be that thing because these are all the reasons I'm not enoughness.
Glad that you highlight that, because that was such the big aha moment, that it is this pendulum swing. It's not necessarily being I am the best and like what we imagine people that have done way too much cocaine on an outing, when they're just like, I am the most magical human and impenetrable.
Nailed
Wow,
it. Yeah.
that's great.
I love
English.
fancy words.
But on the flip side, yes, it has so much to do with our sense of enoughness. And we're just constantly marrying these stories that we've told ourselves. And the reason why I found this book so fascinating to read as well is my mom, actually, who I've talked about on the podcast, has done this incredible amount of self-work in her mid-60s. Better late than never. There is hope for us all. And I've never been more proud, because in our relationship experience, it's completely shifting because she's leaning into these spaces and willing to have a deeper curiosity about herself. And as a result, is unraveling some of these stories that she's told herself her entire life. And she told me she had read this book, and when she had first picked it up, she hated the book. It was the book's fault. It was a terrible book. She admitted, she made a couple chapters and she was just like, oh no, it's bullshit and da da da.
That was her ego, right? Being like, her ego's like, we don't need this. Shush, shush, shush.
It was like
step away.
She said, she was just like, I thought it was horrendous. And obviously she revisited and read it, and she's like, I felt all those things because it was actually her ego. Obviously she's reading it and being like, this, I resonate a lot with what this is saying. And her ego was like, oh no, we're being found, shut her down.
Yeah.
But she finally did read through, because in her storyline, and I think it happens to a lot of individuals, when there's hardships in life, and it's that victimhood mentality that can really be married, and the storytelling within that. And that was a lot of the life that she led. If you're trying to actually make peace in your life and be present,
yeah,
that's where it's going to start to put the biggest fights up, because it's like we have to deploy the defense system majorly, because it also doesn't want to be extinguished. And I think that's another facet to really highlight, is that you're never going to extinguish your ego. I think that even the people that are the most practiced or have dedicated their lives to living in presence and peace still have this constant battle, but it's about creating space and awareness. If you're having a conversation with somebody, or let's say go from the work standpoint and you get a critique about something, how many times do we hyper personalize that into what that means for who we are? Or on the other side, you might go, well, my boss is a fucking idiot. All of that is doubling down. Whereas instead, if you actually created the space, you would realize it's not a personal attack on your being. If you're able to create the space, you actually can reframe it and be like, what can I learn here? Especially if there's things that people say to you that trigger or kick up something in you, not even in an argumentative type of way, but when you feel that pang in yourself of like, oh, I didn't love that. Generally, that's something to get curious about, instead of being like, why did that make me feel that way? Why did I react that way? Was it perhaps an ego-driven reaction? Probably, because it's the one, if you are not aware of it, it is running your life. It is absolutely running your life.
Right there, when you said about the curiosity around, why did I get that ping to the ego, really? It is the way. That is the way. It's probably not going to happen, but you might completely dismantle the ego before this lifetime's done. But more than anything, it's about not having that in the driver's seat. We talk that thing of alignment is essentially getting that psyche and that soul to align with your human condition, which is like the ego. But what you're wanting is to tap into, which you mentioned before, is like getting closer to that instinct. I say instinctual, but essentially like soul, self, and getting quiet with self, listening, giving a little bit of a space to watch kind of your human, almost like watch yourself. Cause we can hear our thoughts, right? You can hear yourself thinking, and we think we're our thoughts, and we're not, because how could you witness your thoughts if you're your thoughts? And it's creating a little bit of space. It's all these different things, and getting curious of like, oh, why did my ego get kicked up? And where that alignment is, and where it's about what we mentioned in the earlier intro is like mastering, moving towards that mastery of ego versus the mastery over you as a person, is getting to a practice and getting to a space where you better understand the listening of your psyche and your spirit self, so that you can, I don't speak that from a religious standpoint. It can be if that resonates for you and that's your modality. But I say that quite literally just from the psyche and spirit. And you listen to that, and then you translate that through your human experience and your ego, and you utilize that to identify as or move towards. But even then, you want to have it very loosely. You don't want to have an attachment, because when you even spoke of like your mom online doing all the shopping, that sort of thing, the feeding wasn't necessarily, yes, it's feeding the ego, but more than anything, the ego need to be fed more to quiet the calls from the soul, saying like, something's not right here. Can I talk to you for a second? Pretty busy here shopping. Sorry, can't now. And that, so they're shopping and they're drinking and they're smoking and I say I've been there. I do my own. I still have my moments without a doubt. But I say we.
I've fought it every day for
like
while.
we all are constantly trying to outrun and turn the volume down on that psyche and the spirit, because we've never actually learned to have a really relationship with it. That's conditioned out of us at very, very young ages. But we play these large prices if we keep ending up in the same dynamics, the same relationships, the same cycles. And we're at this place of, well, why? Because we're constantly trying to control outside factors through our ego, versus going to that quiet space, connecting with self, connecting with that spirit, connecting with our like most kind of clear parts of ourselves, and then translating that through our human experience of the ego. That sounds so esoteric, you know? And so it's one of those things of like, okay, so say I've just had a conversation with a friend, and some of the things they said, my initial bump was like, fuck you, man. Like, fuck yourself. It's that also going, then instead of saying the fuck you, I could think it in my head in that moment, I don't have access to, my ego is flared up. That is clearly that. But then it's having that awareness of going like, okay, that's something to pay attention to. Something really got kicked up. And yeah, they might be being an asshole in this moment. Okay. But me getting flared up is my ego getting flared up. That's what's actually happening. Whether or not what they said was right, wrong, good, or bad, that's actually not the point. The point is, where did it ping for me in that moment? Because if it's my friend, clearly I know like they're a good person, they're having a moment. So it's not, do you know what I mean? It's one thing if it's a stranger. And even then, who is it and what is it to you? They're a stranger. Who cares? You know, at least if no one's in direct harm, it's still at your ego. But it's that going away and going, whoa, what was there for me? Where do I even feel it in my body? What was said to me that really kicked up the ping? What was the sentiment, or what was the word, or what was the thing? Well, go back. When did that affect me, that I was trying to protect myself versus being able to recognize that person was in pain and all those different things? That's it. It's like our pain. I think Eckhart talks a lot about it. The pain body.
I love that. Yes. That was
the
like
pain.
one of the biggest things. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's like it hits our pain body, and then we want to protect ourselves from that. So we go, get in there, ego, get them. Versus where the actual dissolve of the pain body is being with the pain body and recognizing that there's no external there's nothing external outside of outside of if you're in direct harm, like an abusive relationship, or you're in consistent emotional abuse, or there's things that are, or you have to say, this isn't a person that I want to continue to invite in my life because they live in their pain body. They only reside in their pain body of disgruntlement and anger and all those things. And yes, you do not want to expose your psyche nor your ego to that on a regular basis, because then it only feeds that continually, right? But where I'm talking about those kind of like little pings and creating that space enough to go to like, oh, I was trying to protect myself in that moment, but because that was hitting upon something I identified as, they said that they made fun of something and, that made me feel less than. And then it's one of those things, well, is there truth to that? And you're like, no, man, like it was a moment in time. But that's where it dissolves those things. And that's where you can then go to that kind of more clear state versus going to that person to make sure they know they can never say that to you. And it's one thing if it's a pattern. If it's become a pattern between you and that person, yeah, conversation needs to take place. They need to be clear of like, hey, this is the end. This is what's rocking. Can we adjust accordingly? But there's so many things that are just within that kicked up state of ego. And that then gets in the driver's seat, makes your decisions for you, decides the conversations, decides your reply, versus recognizing, oof, that got kicked up. Let me go check in with spirit and psyche, and then decide what I'm going to communicate to ego of what's the next step. And that's how you take a more of a you being in the driver's seat and the ego being in that passenger.
At the end of the day, no human I've met so far has made it through without pain in their life. And probably you've got this pain body that's been built from a very young age. Not even probably, absolutely.
It is. So it's over time. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, we become so, it's like we just deny ourselves in such a big way from actually exploring and excavating and almost like celebrating to a degree that that's part of who we are and processing that. Instead, it's like, as I say, the ego just creates this massive militia and is like, this is our story and we're going to marry that and we're going to feed that, because that way most things in our life can be everybody else's problem or that circumstance and this circumstance, instead of just going deeply inward. And there is something bigger than this outer experience that we're all trying to create. Like, look how fucked up the world has become in so many big ways. And it's because of all these like mass ego-driven decisions and like people kind of banding together on those wagons, and it just ends up multiplying. Whereas if more people did take the time to actually go in and not live in that like subconscious or unconscious default setting, it would undoubtedly be a much better place. And the only way to do that as well, and we talk about it so often on the podcast, but is through vulnerability. Because a lot of that militia that I'm saying deployed by the ego is really this lack of vulnerability in a big way. And when it comes to connecting with other people, we can't do that without also showing up vulnerably. And also connecting with self, which really is connecting with other people, which I know sounds like I'm going in this big loop, but I'm like, that is how it works. Like, you can feel the energy of that and the energy that you put out into the world when you are living in this more heart-centered space. A good example for myself of like ego, and I actually sent Lori the page because obviously I've talked about the television career I had. I loved it. And there was this whole thing about people in the news. And it was like, the popular tabloid press does not primarily sell news, but negative emotion. Food for the pain body. Outrage screams the 3-inch headline, or bastards. The British tabloid press excels at this. They know that negative emotion sells far more papers than news does. There's a tendency in the news media in general, including television, to thrive on negative news. The worse things get, the more excited the presenters become. And often the negative excitement is generated by the media itself. Pain bodies just love it. it was interesting when I was getting to that point of not wanting to be in my career anymore and reading that, I was like, exactly. Because at the time when I was feeling very misaligned, we were coming off the heels of the pandemic. Therefore, I was spending a lot of more inward time. And I also was surrounding myself with this new community, being people that I met in the motorcycle community that truly have been the catalyst for me allowing emotions and vulnerability. I'm convinced maybe I would have gotten there, but like you all were placed there as that lesson for me because it is 100% where it started. And it's because how things cultivated in the dynamic, people were willing to witness and receive genuinely. And so eventually everything that I had built up wall wise got chipped down, and we're still chipping. But this has been a massive life transformation for myself. And as soon as I was taking those walls down, all of a sudden, you're listening a little bit more inward. And I was like, oh, this is my dream, but it doesn't feel good. Why doesn't it feel good? And I mean, like in that depth of listening in your solar plexus of like, something's off. And as I read that, I was like, fucking exactly. I used to have this theory over because the newsroom environment was, I know it's such an overused term, but it was toxic. It really was. Like, I understand there's lots of people in corporate toxic workplaces. Like, this just was the ultimate definition of it. You could feel it energetically in the hallways. And I was walking through that every day. And it's because, can you imagine, like, not only because many people are addicted to the news, and that makes sense because it's feeding their pain bodies. But when it talked about the presenters and the excitement, I remember being in production meetings. And when big, crazy stories would break, there is a fervor. Like you can feel like, yeah, let's do this kind of thing. And I'm just like, that is such a propulsion of negativity. It's unbelievable. But it is what the ego kind of loves and thrives on too. So it was like the amount of disconnect I started to feel. And thank God I created the space to like, even still in this evolution, I don't know exactly where I'm going. Like, I know I still have alignment issues and I'm trying to like figure it out because I would love to marry everything. Like if I'm a creative, if I'm going to do creative work, I want it to like flow through me. And I'm still in situations where there's resistance there, which tells me everything that I need to know. And I'm accepting that where I'm at is where I need to be at the moment, but it's that trusting if I listen and lean into that intuitive nature of whatever this innerness is, ultimately, I'm going to learn the lessons I'm supposed to learn along the way, which are probably going to be really fucking uncomfortable. And also understanding that it's not a destination that we're after either in life. Like it's always like, oh, when we get there, or when I have this, or when I do Y. No. It's honestly about the lesson learning and like trying to do it from as much of heart-centered space versus an ego space as much as possible. And again, deeply understanding daily, you're going to get it wrong. And I can say daily, I'm going to get it wrong. And I can say that and feel very peaceful about it. Because daily, I'm also creating practices now. And especially after this read of just bringing myself back to present, catching myself more and more when I'm either in future thought or past thought, and just being like mindful present. I've had to have some of the deepest, craziest conversations, and that continues weekly. And it's like, how do I be here in this moment? And if something's said to me in those conversations that does cause that ping, take a breath before I respond. Take a breath before I respond so that it's not instantly coming from that piece of my ego that is like, fuck you, or you hurt me, or you did this. The practices that we can infuse in our life to create that little bit of buffer and space aren't monumental, but it's also easier said than done.
Like I hear you saying is like, even though I will fail at it every single day, I'm okay with that because that's not the point. The point is that I'm practicing a new way of being to create a new experience within my life. And that being one of more of that like soul psyche connection versus that's driving my life versus elements that are still, very heavy weighted with ego.
I can see a lot of ways when I reflect that my ego has gotten in my way.
Mm-hmm.
And those moments that also make you cringe a little bit over how you showed up in certain capacities, which honestly, when that happens, I do kind of appreciate it because then I know that there's growth that has happened since whatever that experience was. I think anytime we look at our past versions of ourselves and feel that, then you know that you've grown, or else it wouldn't make you cringe at your own self. You'd be like, high five, we did amazing, which would also be very ego-esque.
I was just going to say it's the ego that's cringing.
Yeah,
it's the soul that's high-fiving because the ego is going, I identified as a kind, nice person, or I identified as this. And then when you look back and your lens changes and you recognize that even if you in the moment thought you were showing up in one way, that reflection and that changing of the lens then is like, oh no, that was straight up ego. Like even if the surface intention looked one way, my intention and or I missed the mark, and then your ego is still going like, you got it wrong, where you're like, but it's not about getting it right. It's like, how do I get it closer to the more like human soul-centeredness of it all? So that's the other funny part is like a lot of times we'll do that, right? Like we all do that where we reflect and we're like, I want to be less in the state of ego. And they're like, look at that time that you didn't get it. And your ego's judging your ego.
Totally.
I also like to make a point that I believe is exceptionally important, and I don't think anyone would disagree necessarily, is that the pace at which we're living life and that we're pushed to live life at this and take information and be all the things and do all the things and it is feeding ego and keeping you distracted with your ego at a rate we've never seen before. And especially the big push for individualism, which at the end of the day, I don't mean in regards to not like be true to yourself and be those kind of things, but we live with the undertone, especially in the westernized culture of just like, fuck them, do you. Make your money, do your thing, and you're like, well, you can't get away from that. We are all quite literally interconnected. This has been able to be proven at this point is just how interconnected our energy is, and our brain waves, our neurological wiring even maps up when you're in a room long enough with other people, even if you're not talking to them. Like there's all these different elements where you're like, you are not as individualized by a landslide as you think you are. And ignoring everybody else and ignoring your connection to the collection is one of the biggest mistakes that we're making, because we are feeding these individualized egos at a rate we've never seen before. And we're being pushed to do so, thinking that that is our line of towards happiness and well-being. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And so it's also recognizing the importance of slowing down and creating that space that you just mentioned prior. It's so incredibly simple. It's so incredibly difficult. And you are now addicted to certain things like your telephone and our social media and all those things to pull us so quickly and be so uncomfortable with any amount of quiet and silence. And we are in this like cycle in this machine that is so incredibly detrimental to us as how essentially to our well-being, because we are living in such intense states of ego, and chronic stress then only amplifies that for us to like feed that more, because we get that quick dopamine hit. And, if they're the reason that this is all going to hell, then that's great. I can just find other people. I can just do one more, and we just replace it with something else. And everybody else is doing it that way. So that is how you human. That is how you do
Yeah.
life. And mental illness and, suicide rates are soaring. Mental illness, chronic illness is just at like, we are first time, I think, in history that we're actually living, longevity has gone down versus up. So how do we have the most advanced medical that we've ever had, yet we're dying earlier? Being responsible and accountable for slowing down enough that you give yourself a real chance to just even hear your fucking self. Because ego's like, fuck that, I got this. Girl, I got this. Let's go. And you're like, yeah, that sounds easier and fun, way more fun. But we pay these huge prices, and you see, so many of us get to certain areas of our life. We're like, how did I get here?
There's so many people that are probably listening that can't remember the last time they actually took time. And I don't mean like sitting at home and binge watching your show. Like it's like this constant need to fill. And the minute you actually pay attention to it, like we've said this before, try and tell yourself you're doing a digital detox. Watch how many times you reach for that phone.
Mm-hmm.
Try and tell yourself that you're going to, not have the TV or the music or the nothing, and just like sit with yourself and just watch how many times you get up and try and do something to escape it.
It's getting as clear within yourself, because that is actually what creates effective change. You've been around somebody that all of a sudden you saw them one way, and within a few years, there's a different energy about them. They move different. They speak different. There's different, opportunities that have come into their life, or even if there's tough stuff that they went through, they come out on the other side and they're different because of it. And you feel either inspired, or you feel moved, or you feel reflective, or you feel different, or you just look at it and go, I want a little bit of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you intrinsically want to change, not because somebody forced it on you or somebody like jammed it down your throat or this. And like, by all means, I have been the person that tries to jam it down people's throat, because I'm just
I really
what
did.
the fuck have you, and and I still have moments without a doubt. But that's my ego wanting them to stop being that way, so they stop making me feel a certain way. It's all my ego. That's all that is. And then I'm always like, that's not, and then if I'm doing that as well, I'm actually interrupting their process. Because that isn't the state of actual change. That's just more ego transferring itself to another state of ego. That's not well-being. That's not actual change. That's just adaptation. Because someone withheld love, or I felt enough shame that I'm going to transfer my behavior. But that's not actual growth. That's not actual reflection. That's not actual like stepping closer into our spirit and soul and our psyche. And so, but that's me being uncomfortable, and they're making that so I got to tell them, cut the shit.
I spent so much time doing that. Like, holy
tough. It's
hell.
so fucking, that is my biggest Achilles heel. It's a thing that I've gotten so much better at it. Like, the fact that I can even just say it in my head rather than it like escape my mouth is a huge win for me. And then like be like, whoa, what was that about even later? But before I couldn't, it was like the constant cycle of thinking it, saying it, and then being like, ugh, that wasn't mine to say. Thinking it, saying it, ugh, that wasn't mine to say. Like,
or thinking it, saying it, and being like, I'm giving you your salvation. Why don't you see that?
Yes, that was my first. Yes, 100%. That was my first part of the journey. Was like, I'm a genius. Here you are.
Oh, 1,000%. That's still me sometimes.
But here's the thing I would like to point out in that. A lot of times too, it's because you genuinely, like have that it feels like the gift, and it feels instinctually like it's a gift. There actually probably is a gift in there. What you've done though, is you've delivered it through your ego versus delivering the gift, because we're so egocentric, and that's what we've been practicing. Because clearly I do this for a living, is give advice. And now I'm learning in that scope of the counsel world and stuff. So that is a strength of mine. But the way in which I was going about delivering it was so heavy through ego, is that the gift got lost in translation. And then it was all about my ego in the end. So it's not so much that, because some people will be like, but I do have really good advice, or I do have like an instinct to like, I can help. And you're like, you're probably right in that. But because that you aren't doing your internal work, this beautiful thing that you have is in this gaudy ass wrapping paper with so much fucking tape they can't get in it, with a bow that they don't know what, you know what I mean? Like you have just give the fucking thing from the most like, and sometimes that gift comes from you just sharing energy. Sometimes, like Chrissy and I, when we've talked about, sometimes it's just witnessing the pain in another person. You might have more answers, but that's not yours to give. So sometimes it's just knowing that it's like this person needs to just feel less alone in this moment, not you being like, I'm here, you're not alone. Don't say that you feel alone. I'm
Snap
right
a
here.
selfie, be like, I was here helping.
Oh, just me being a helper. Like it's those things of like when you start to get centered, you then can hear those moments where you're like, oof, this is the gift that I have to offer, but you don't then wrap it up in a state of ego, which is that's why it's like the evolution of it, kind of like pruning it back to its most pure state of whatever it is that you feel compelled to give. And if you're also pruning it back to that state, you recognize where you're like, that's not to give, that's just to hold the feeling, the discomfort, the whatever, and then just let it be. And that's actually the gift in itself. And that's where that's where like real change actually happens, because we're speaking soul to soul, not ego to ego.
So in a nutshell, we're all assholes.
Yeah. We're all these like beautiful beings wrapped up in a big old sausage casing of insecure ego.
That's actually a beautiful descriptor, because like I've never seen a sexy sausage casing.
No.
Blech. Anyways,
No.
I think that leads us to
motivation.
Guess what, team? My motivation.
We're gonna journal.
We are going to, but
oh, yes,
there's a twist.
Let's hear it. I'm in.
So talking about those pings, right? You have a conversation with somebody, and how many times if that ping's kicked up, do you ruminate over it afterwards, right? You're revisiting the conversation in their mind, and either you're getting more judgmental or begrudged or heightened, or it's coming from this place of lack of, I should have said, or I didn't, or they didn't hear me. And all of a sudden you've carried one interaction with a human into your entire day. And most likely because of that, you're in this indignant phase where all of a sudden it's bleeding into all these other parts of your day. We've talked about this before. How many times does it start with one thing and all of a sudden the world's conspiring against you and nothing's going your way? So let's say you're having one of those, because it's going to happen. If you're doing a reflective journal, maybe you're a daily journaler, maybe not. I highly encourage it. But you can actually use some prompts. So revisiting that interaction, let's say it's something you just can't shake. What was I feeling? So you can explore what emotions were happening in that moment. What was kicked up within you? Why did I react? Get curious about that. There is probably reflection of something inside of you. That is generally what is kicked up within us, is something that we haven't either explored, looked at. It's a pain point for us. So why did I react? And then analyzing, and most likely, but was it ego driven?
There's even like I think that's such a great exercise. There's even the 5 whys kind of. It's a bit of a cognitive behavioral technique, and essentially it's like, why did that bother me? And then so say someone said something like you and I'll, let's try it out. Let's see.
Yeah, let's
okay. So pick something that you triggered your ego, that, or you don't even know if it triggered your ego. You're just like, I was triggered.
Okay. I was getting feedback on a financial segment, and basically like a whole section was rewritten. And I was like, don't love that.
Why do you think you didn't love that?
Because it made me feel like I was wrong and I'd put a lot of effort into it.
And when you feel wrong, when you've put a lot of effort into it, what brings up feelings? Why is that an issue?
Because I'm a perfectionist.
Why are you a perfectionist?
Oh, that's going real deep. That started from being a little kid and being taught that I have to be perfect at all times, present, polished, shellacked.
Why did you need to be polished, perfect, shellacked?
It's what I was told.
And if you didn't do what you were told,
Then I didn't feel like I was enough.
and so when that moment happened, do you think that might have been ego?
Yep.
Trying to protect you from not feeling enough?
100% it was.
Yeah. So
And you
it's
know what's
like,
funny
yeah,
is
go
even when
ahead.
it was like presented in that conversation, like we actually identified that in the moment because he was like, you don't like this.
The why thing is a really great way to better get clarity. And it's almost always going to come down to your ego. Now, again, if it's a pattern, conversations you can have and all the things, but like that initial understanding of if it's your ego, it's almost going to always be yes. That's why you have the ping. And the whys is a great one to get to the more root. If you notice, Chrissy said like, oh God, that's a big story, where to begin. But it actually was much more simpler than that.
Yeah.
And you were able to be like, oh, because that's what was asked of me. Okay. You know, why did you do what was asked of me? A lot of people come to the conclusions, including myself, where it's like, I wasn't enough if I wasn't, or I probably the layer under that would be like, if I'm not enough, I don't feel loved. If I don't feel loved, I don't feel safe. If I don't feel safe, I feel, like at the end of the day, that's why conditioning works in our formative years, because we are taking everything so closely to face value that it is ours to carry. And then our little egos grow and grow to protect us or to adapt so that we survive, so that we aren't lost from the tribe and the tiger comes and eats us. So
and that's the thing. Sometimes it's like serves you in so many ways. And then there's certain parts of these survival mechanisms where you're like, this doesn't serve me anymore. But then you have to like really work hard to dismantle it. Because how
really
long have
do.
you habitually practiced to be like X or Y?
Yeah. And the other thing I'd say for the motivation maintenance is like, in those moments, as soon as you feel the ping, if you feel the ping in a big way, go to the bathroom. Even if you're just like, oh, sorry, hold on 2 seconds. I just have to, even if it's a more intense conversation, you're like, this seems silly that I have to interrupt, but I have to go to the bathroom so bad. Like, who cares? But like, interrupt the moment in time to give yourself enough space to just be like, oh, I just got pinged. Because what happens is if you don't, you think you're taking care of it in the moment for essentially to relieve yourself of that ping in that moment. But what you end up doing is you end up essentially telling your brain also, good. Every time you snap back or every time you say the thing, that feeling goes away because you put that person in their spot or they blah, 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 blah. And you essentially send the signal to your brain of like positive reinforcement that like, yes, that did make the feeling go away. Or you also feed the addiction to the heightened state of emotion that the ego loves, which is the like combativeness. But then you have the come down afterwards, where when you're in a clearer state, you're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Or like, oh, that's now you got to go back and do repair and have a whole thing. So like the difference between just saying, I got to go to the bathroom or take the breath is this ripple effect to so much other areas where you either reinforce the ego habitual behavior or you get the chemical hit of the addiction to the conflict, or you have to go down this whole fucking route of time and energy of the feeling afterwards, the repair afterwards, and all the different things. Now, there's no way you're going to get around it, but you can get better at it. Like it's not like a snap of the fingers and it's done, but I'm just like painting the picture to show you what we talk about when we say the amount of suffering that we have in our lives that is created through ego is exponential compared to the energy and the time we could be saving by just going, oh, sorry, I gotta go pee quick.
Yeah.
and then getting home and doing a little why reflective work, and then being like, okay, well, what do I do with that? Or how would I release that? Do I need to have a little like visualization, meditation? Do I need to go to therapy? Like whatever. But you don't realize, I had no idea. I had no fucking idea the turmoil and the energy that I was expending on a day-to-day basis because of the amount that my ego got kicked up. Like it was 90% of my day, I kid you not. And then I'd go around, because even if I wasn't getting kicked up, I was going around trying to prove to myself through my interactions that I was exactly who I wanted and thought to be. Because if I wasn't, I was nothing. If I wasn't that person, if this versus coming from like my personality, you wouldn't say has drastically changed as far as my wildness and my playfulness and my funniness. But my intention with ego was so that people liked me, so I wasn't rejected and I wasn't on the outs and I wasn't alone and then wanted to fucking die. Like really. Now that comes from a place of living through pure love of life and joy. And I'm just going to express that, and you're invited to that world. And so on the outside, they don't look that different, but they're a very different experience within myself. And so it doesn't matter who joins or doesn't join, it affects me none. Whereas before, if they didn't join, it was like, well, fuck you if you want to be boring. Or fuck you kind of thing. Like, and obviously there's still moments where I'm just like, well, if you want to be boring, I'm good. Like that but it's not in a state of like, you've offended me by not. Whereas like I could be the only one in the room having a time, and that I'm good. Because it's inside out.
Perpetually offended.
Yeah. Because that's how it's gauging. Because the ego isn't tangible. It lives and breathes from a state of input and output. And so it's constantly gauging from that source of external sources. That's why you need to get it to pivot and get its input from your psyche and your spirit. That's where it needs to get its input, not externally. That's why it's constantly grabbing on to everything to make it feel safe. You know how you make it feel safe? Get quiet with it and let it fucking know, I got you. Don't worry. None of that actually is real. But that takes work and it takes commitment. It takes discomfort and creating new habits. But I tell you, from somebody that lived a lot of chaos internally, I live pretty peacefully at this point. Obviously, you're a human being and you fucking some days are worse than others. Like today, I woke up late. I had toothpaste all over my shirt. I couldn't find the cord I needed. And at first I was like, fuck. And then I was like giggling to myself. Because I was like, I don't even have pants on right now. I'm in my underwear. It's those things where you're just like, who cares? Who fucking cares? Like,
who fucking cares?
Who fucking cares?
Why? Also, ever since you said why, I've had NSYNC stuck in my head, and I understand that it's bye. But it's now it's in there.
That's perfect. To all the listeners, sing that song to remember why when your ego gets kicked up. That'll lighten the mood. Why? I don't have a quote. There, good.
Yay. This quote is Teal Swan. The ego wants to distinguish itself. It wants to be things like good, right, better, superior, more. There's nothing inherently wrong with this drive, but most people are not aware enough of this element of ego to integrate it or to consciously work with it. As a result, their non-physical self and physical self are not engaging in an aligned relationship. Instead, their ego is subconsciously running the show. Awareness is everything, my friends.
100%. Well, I just got a glimpse again of my picture. It's ridiculous.
The whole time.
All right. Well, my friends, that is your motivation.
You've just listened to the Motivation Podcast with your host, Chrissy Van, and me, Lori Joy Kingwell.
Thanks for joining us along the ride. We've got new episodes dropping every Monday, and we're all about community. So follow us on Instagram at Motivation Podcast and visit our website at themotivation.com.
And in the meantime, tanks full and full throttle.